Hello there, Little Masters, and welcome to Season 2 and the new weekly version of the Prancing Pony Podcast, where tonight the good stuff is going to make you see stone giants.
Well, West to Hall, my friends. I'm Sean Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the man of the West, the tinder to my flint, Alan Sisto.
Thank you, Sean, although I'm not really sure the narrator's reference to tinder and flint carries the same meaning in today's age of mobile phones. But folks, swipe right on the Prancing Pony Podcast, okay? Tonight we're going to get some real thrills and chills as we follow our heroes over hill and under hill.
Yeah, there's a lot of great and constructions in this chapter, I have to say. I'm really looking forward to getting down to some serious word nerding here today.
Word nerding. Is that the verb form? I thought it might be word nerdering. But
could be.
Whatever it's called, you're going to be doing this as soon as you can, aren't you?
Yes, I am, because it's time for another installment of Philology Faire.
Woohoo!
Yay.
Yay.
All right. Well, the words I want to geek out on tonight are a couple of similar and possibly related words that should be familiar to every Tolkien reader. Etten, as in the Etten Moors, and Ent. And we actually hinted at this topic back in episode 56 when we talked about the trolls. And Alan, I'm actually going to let you start. You have something that you found on Etten in Anderson's Annotated Hobbit, don't you?
I did, and it actually comes to us from a note belonging to this very chapter.
It's almost like we planned that.
Almost. So note 5 to chapter 4 of Anderson's Annotated Edition has some information about the place called the Etten Moors, or sometimes the Etten Dales, which Bilbo and his friends find themselves in today. And here's the quote from Anderson. In his nomenclature of the Lord of the Rings, which as an aside was a document that Tolkien created as a commentary in order to help translators assigned the unenviable task of translating Lord of the Rings, along with all of its very English names for characters and places and creatures. That commentary is now available in Hammond and Skull's Reader's Companion. But anyway,
very cool resource. Very cool thing.
It is a very cool
through,
resource. Yeah. Frankly, the whole Reader's Companion is a wonderful resource. So
true.
Having the nomenclature in there is even more amazing. So in his nomenclature, Tolkien notes in the entry for Ettendales that it is meant to be a common speech name, not an elvish name, though it contains an obsolete element, Etten, or troll or ogre. Old English Eoten, Middle English Etten, is usually translated as giant or monster. Now, it's spelled E-T-A-Y-N, Etain. No, I'm sorry, Etain, in the Middle English poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and that's glossed as ogre or giant in the edition that Tolkien edited with E.V. Gordon in 1925. So Anderson also points out that Grendel, the monster in Beowulf, is referred to as an Eoten.
That's right. And that Old English word Eoten is a cognate of the Norse word Jotun, which means a giant, which, a lot of people know from Jotunheim, the home of the giants in Norse mythology.
Absolutely.
Looking into this word a little deeper, which I promised to do back in episode 56, we actually find that there may be a connection between this word Eoten and another Old English word for giant, which is Ent.
Oh, yeah. We talked about that a few episodes back. What was the Old English phrase? Enta Georg?
Enta Georg, Enta Georg.
Oh, that's right, Enta Georg.
Yeah, I think the G is pronounced as a Y.
You're right.
And it's translated as work of giants.
Do you know how much I want to edit that? I want to edit that, but I'm not going to. I'll just own up to it. I botched that.
No,
Enta
hey, I've
Georg.
done it. I've done it. It's Old English. It's hard,
Yeah.
Hey, these are hard words to pronounce, and I am not even 100% sure of myself here. So, we recently found out that we have been saying Ophir mode, and it's actually over mode. So, I'm not sure if we've had a chance to correct ourselves on that one yet. So, yeah.
I don't think anything just on social media, but I don't think on the show we have.
Yeah, so these Old English words, we're doing our best, folks. So, bear with us. Don't hesitate to tell us if we're getting it wrong.
Oh, please.
But yeah, Enta Georg, work of giants. Sometimes you see it in the phrase Eld Enta Georg or Orthunk Enta Georg, which is old work of giants or cunning work of giants, respectively. And it's a phrase that appears in a lot of Old English poems to describe the ancient Roman ruins that were left in Britain after the Romans left. And we talked about this back in Akalabath, I believe.
I think so.
And I think I even used that as an opportunity to mention that this word Ent in Old English was what inspired Tolkien to invent the race of Ents in The Lord of the Rings.
That's right. And I actually have a little something on that from one of Tolkien's letters.
Oh, cool.
In letter 157, he says, As usually with me, they grew, talking about the giants, or I'm sorry, about the Ents, they grew rather out of their name than the other way about. I always felt that something ought to be done about the peculiar Anglo-Saxon word Ent for a giant or mighty person of long ago to whom old works were ascribed.
That's right. Yeah, and actually that letter was quoted in the book that I went to for my deeper look. So see, it's like it's all coming together here.
Yeah, it is.
There's a book called The Ring of Words, Tolkien and the Oxford English Dictionary, which is actually edited by a few lexicographers who work for the Old English Dictionary. And it's a book that every Tolkien fan and word nerd should read. But it's actually got a combined entry for the words Ent and Etten, and I'll read a little bit of it here.
Sure.
They say, in Old English there were at least two inherited terms meaning giant, Eoten and Ent. It goes on to talk about basically all the things we just talked about, Alan. So it talks about Jotunheim and Sir Gawain, and then it goes on to talk about the Etten Moors. And then it says, in the drafts of the first two books of The Lord of the Rings, the region of the Etten Moors is called the Entish Dales, or the Entish lands.
Fascinating.
At this stage of Tolkien's conception, Ent and Etten, E-T-T-E-N or E-T-T-I-N, are interchangeable, both with a bad sense. Then, as the concept of Treebeard and his people gradually emerges from earlier hints about tree men or tree giants, the two words part company. This can be seen in the plot plans. T-Bird. 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 Treebeard is at first a dangerous giant.
He's a 57 T-Bird.
Right.
Oh, goodness. That's too funny.
Man, that's great. T-Bird.
T-Bird.
I could just see...
I do not know what you're calling me.
I can just see Ents with leather jackets, just like...
Slick back hair.
Greased hair. Yeah. Oh, man.
This is bad.
This is. It's bad, but it's so good. Let's keep going.
It is. I'm picturing that right now. I wish I was an artist and could draw one.
Yeah. Driving around with the top down.
That's very hasty, though, driving a T-Bird.
Very hasty. But it would be very green fuel he'd be using, though. He'd probably be using the biodiesel.
Until his daddy took the T-Bird away. There's your Beach Boys reference right there. They're going to have fun until then.
I had to mute myself. I was laughing so hard there.
Oh, yeah, you don't want to blow the mic out there.
Yeah. Oh, man. So anyway, Treebeard.
So where were we?
Treebeard is at first a dangerous giant. And you can actually find some of the evidence for this in History of Middle-earth, Volume 7, The Treason of Isengard.
Okay.
But then is planned to turn out a decent giant. There's a penciled note in there by Tolkien that expresses the difference between trolls, stone inhabited by goblin spirit or stone giants, and the tree folk, to which is added in ink, Ents.
Wow. I really wish we'd found that before we recorded, 56.
I know, right?
Before we recorded the trolls.
It's exactly the kind of thing that would have fit in very well into our sidebar on the nature of trolls. But that's okay, because it'll also fit well into our discussion on the nature of stone giants in this episode.
Well, yeah, clearly. And with that, why don't we just go ahead and jump right in?
Okay, well, actually, before we do, I have one more little thing that I want to mention. Sorry. In episode 55, which just released a few days ago as of this recording, we were trying to guess how tall Vanderbros Bullroarer Took... I really cannot talk tonight, Alan. Bullroarer Took was.
I cannot be responsible for that.
And, Alan, you guessed about 4.5 feet. Do you remember that?
That is correct. I do. In fact, I was listening to that just the other day, prepping for our Patreon postscript.
Our postscript. Well, after listening to us fumbling around trying to guess how tall he was, listener Chris B. in Michigan, who wrote in with that really lovely meditation on the movies that we read in that same episode. Chris emailed us and reminded us that in the prologue concerning hobbits to Fellowship, Tolkien actually tells us, according to the Red Book, Vanderbros Took, Bullroarer, son of Isambros III, was 4'5" and able to ride a horse. It. He was surpassed in all Hobbit records only by two famous characters of old, but that curious matter, of course, is dealt with in The Lord of the Rings.
That it is.
So there you go. We didn't have to guess. We just had to think about it ahead of time and do the research. But still, you were so accurate. You were off by 1 inch.
That is why nobody wants to take me fishing. Thank you, Chris. And with that terrible joke, we're going to go ahead and jump right in.
Awful.
Yeah, really bad. I'm going to go ahead and read the first paragraph and a half of this, and we'll just get right into Chapter 4, Over Hill and Under Hill.
All right, let's do it.
There were many paths that led up into those mountains, and many passes over them. But most of the paths were cheats and deceptions, and led nowhere, or to bad ends. And most of the passes were infested by evil things and dreadful dangers. The dwarves and the Hobbit, helped by the wise advice of Elrond, and the knowledge and memory of Gandalf, I have a memory of this place, took the right road to the right pass.
If you don't think of that while you're reading that, I'm sorry.
It's impossible not to.
It's
The
impossible
memory of
not to.
Gandalf.
Yeah.
I mean, I can just see him turning around to Bilbo. When in doubt, Bilbo, always follow your nose.
Anyway.
Long days after they had climbed out of the valley and left the last homely house miles behind, they were still going up and up and up. It was a hard path, and a dangerous path, a crooked way and a lonely and a long. Now they could look back over the lands they had left, laid out behind them far below. Far, far away in the west, where things were blue and faint, Bilbo knew there lay his own country of safe and comfortable things, and his little hobbit hole. Of course, we have to, the comfort right there.
We've got our mention of comfort right there.
Have we mentioned that's an important theme?
Yeah,
because if we haven't mentioned that now, is probably the time.
Yeah.
Interesting that most of the paths were just dead ends, or that kind of looped themselves back. They weren't going to get you where you thought they'd go.
Yeah, or worse, they had something in them.
Well,
Evil
the passes,
things, yeah, infested by evil things and dreadful dangers.
Yeah, that's pretty bad.
Yeah.
The wise advice of Elrond.
I like that, and I love this. We talked about in the last chapter, how so much of what they got from their stay in Rivendell was just good information. Remember how poorly equipped these dwarves were when they set out.
Yeah.
They really didn't know what they were doing, and they've been fortunate to have the advice of people like Elrond and somebody like Gandalf on their side. I mean, that's the other thing that strikes me about this this phrasing here is the knowledge and memory of Gandalf.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded that Gandalf is Mithrandir, the Grey Wanderer, and he's a guy who's been around. He's had a lot of traveling experience, and so that's really helping them out here. Absolutely. And I guess we see that, don't we? Every time Gandalf disappears, the dwarves are just,
they're helpless.
They're kind of helpless.
And, I have to say, this is, I think, another one of those moments where we realize just how much there is behind this in terms of outside influence. It's not just that they were lucky in getting the advice of Elrond and having the company of Gandalf who happened to have come through here before. This is all part of that big plan. But
right.
So
why else should
luck,
why else should the great and wise take interest in this band of vagabond dwarves?
That's really trying to do something, really foolish.
Kind of foolish, yeah.
And not something you think is going to have geopolitical impact.
Right.
It doesn't seem to be something that would play in the big picture.
Right.
Though Gandalf, we find out later, of course, Gandalf does think it would. I don't remember now if it's in the version of the tale that's at the end of the appendices in Return of the King, or if it's in
the one that's in the Quest for Erebor
Unfinished Tales. Where he talks about.
I was just listening to our episode on the movies again the other day, and we were talking about that too.
Yeah,
we were talking about those
something about
those
the dragon Sauron might use to terrible effect, and that is a text right out of something.
One of those,
which makes me think it's out of the appendices version because Jackson wouldn't.
Because
have had
that's what Jackson had access to.
Exactly, he wouldn't have had the license to use any text directly from Unfinished Tales. So, that ability, that the fact that Gandalf remembered, knew where he'd been, was able to get that information, and that Elrond had provided that advice, definitely more than just convenient luck. So they did take the right road to the right pass, and yet it would turn out, as we will see, that it's still going to be dangerous. Even before they get to the high mountains, we're already describing this path in pretty negative terms. We got hard, dangerous, crooked, lonely, and long.
Lonely.
This is a
lonely
really
is a very
tough
interesting
road,
descriptor,
isn't it? A lonely path. Nobody else is trying to get over the mountains.
Right.
You know, and I'm reminded of something else. It's funny, you know, we get this idea that this is where, in the last homely house, right? The line about the last homely house tells us that from there west, that's the safe land, and from there east is the dangerous land.
Right.
And yet the trolls were to the west.
We're still in the safe land.
They're in the safe lands. How much worse is it going to get?
Right.
And, you know, we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, the trouble was just beginning, really.
Exactly. That really was just a sampler. Sorry. I'm picturing, you know, like my weekend run to Costco and would you like a sample of troll?
Would you like the danger sampler?
The danger sampler.
The shadow, Sauron's shadow
cups.
sampler. A delicious mix of trolls, goblins,
wargs,
dunlendings, wargs.
Oh, goodness. So this is now a real proper adventure, isn't it? But what is it that Bilbo's thinking about? You know, he's thinking about his own country. He's thinking about his little hobbit hole, the comfortable things.
Yeah, I love that he takes this moment to stop and look back west, doesn't he?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And of course, you know, as you said, you know, west is the direction of civilization. West is, of course, where Bilbo's home is. But I always, you know, think of the fact that in the back of Tolkien's mind, even though nobody would have known this in 1937, 1938 when they're reading this, but, you know, in Tolkien's mind, he knows west is the direction of elves and the Valar and all this enlightenment that we've talked about in the past. And yet it just, you know, in the sort of the small perspective of a hobbit, it just sort of translates to the simple comforts that he holds so dear and that he doesn't have here.
Absolutely.
I kind of love that. But, you know, every time we look west in Tolkien's world, it's always significant. I like that.
It is. You're right. Every single time it is. Even when the wind comes from the west. Remember when we had a couple of moments in the Silmarillion where we realized that was significant. So now that they're thinking about these homey thoughts, what is it that the text actually tells us there about Bilbo's thinking?
So I'll take this next paragraph here. The summer is getting on down below, thought Bilbo, and haymaking is going on and picnics. They will be harvesting and blackberrying before we even begin to go down the other side at this rate. And the others were thinking equally gloomy thoughts, although when they had said goodbye to Elrond in the high hope of a midsummer morning, they had spoken gaily of the passage of the mountains and of riding swift across the lands beyond. They had thought of coming to the secret door in the lonely mountain, perhaps that very next last moon of autumn. And perhaps it will be Durin's day, they had said. Only Gandalf had shaken his head and said nothing.
Foolish, optimistic dwarves.
Yeah.
You
guys have no idea
what
you're getting yourselves into. What lies ahead of you before you get to the mountain.
Yeah.
You know,
just
in
crossing
their
over
way,
these mountains is going to be very difficult.
You know, think back to, was it the beginning of chapter 3 when Bilbo first sees the Misty Mountains and he says, "Is that the mountain?" And they say, "No, that's totally not the mountain."
No.
You know, but in their way, the dwarves are more no more savvy than Bilbo.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And they have the same response that he does. They're thinking the same negative thoughts. I mean, we seem to be kind of, you know, bashing Bilbo a little bit for his, you know, constantly thinking of home, but the dwarves are no better.
Right.
So.
And I wouldn't even say it's bashing. I think it's
we're just observing.
He's out of his element, you know?
Yeah.
You have to be out of your element before you can learn to be in that element. And
that
I think
is true.
You know, he's just starting out here.
That is true. You know, there's a line here about the blackberrying that made me think of you know what, though? That's a movie line, isn't it? It made me think of Sam.
You thinking of the Sam line?
Return of the King, about the strawberries and cream and the.
Yeah.
But that's a movie line because I think in the book that's they talk about strawberries and cream being something that, you know, everybody's partying and enjoying that summer the year after they get back. You know.
I think you're right. Yeah.
So, but it still reminded me of that. It's clear that
it did me too.
The hobbits totally love, you know, parties and picnics and, you know, just having a good time.
And berries.
Blackberries, strawberries. Who doesn't?
Yeah.
You know, sounds good to me.
Exactly.
I could use a little of that. But
what else did I see in here? I think, Oh, you know what? Actually, right before that, there was this passage about the silent seem to dislike being broken. I just wanted to point that out.
Yes,
that's just a neat expression.
That's
makes the silence
oppressive thinking. Yeah,
yes,
it is, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about like oppressive darkness before with Ungoliant and things like that. This is an oppressive silence, and it's an entity, isn't it?
It does
it's a
seem
thing.
that way. It really does.
It seems like a thing with its own will. It doesn't want to be broken.
Ooh, goodness, that is.
I just thought that was neat.
That's a good catch. We've got some other stuff here that we're not going to read, but that's interesting to observe. The fact that Gandalf's knowledge, he's aware of what's going on. He knows that dragons have driven men from the lands. He knows that the goblins have spread. He's fully aware of the risk. He knew full well that evil and danger had grown and thriven. Now, thriven's not a word I use. I usually would use thrived.
No,
but I do love that.
Not in most company, no.
Well, you might use it. You're the class A word nerd. I'm only slightly below you.
I would be the guy who would use it wrong. I'd go to a party and I'd walk up to a group of people and say, "So, that danger sure has thriven lately, hasn't it?" And it's just.
And then everybody would just check
everybody
their
just
phones
clears out.
And, I got to go. I got to take this.
Yeah. Sorry, I got a thing.
I got to do a thing with a person. I got it with I'll see you later.
Just over there.
Someplace else.
Yeah.
So, he knew, Gandalf did, that his plans might go astray because they're past the edge of the wild. They are now in dangerous country. And indeed...
Isn't that cool? Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a wise enough wizard to know just the danger they're in.
They are in real danger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we're going to find out a little bit of that danger next. I'm going to read the next paragraph. He knew that something unexpected might happen, and he hardly dared to hope that they would pass without fearful adventure over those great tall mountains with lonely peaks and valleys where no king ruled. They did not. All was well until one day they met a thunderstorm. More than a thunderstorm, a thunder battle. You know how terrific a really big thunderstorm can be down in the land and in a river valley, especially at times when two great thunderstorms meet and clash. More terrible still are thunder and lightning in the mountains at night, when storms come up from east and west and make war. The lightning splinters on the peaks, and rocks shiver, and great crashes split the air and go rolling and tumbling into every cave and hollow, and the darkness is filled with overwhelming noise and sudden light. Bilbo had never seen or imagined anything of the kind. I added that last sentence because I thought it really fit.
Absolutely.
We're supposed to be Bilbo here, right? I mean, that's the character we're identifying. So we need to remember this is something beyond what we have seen or imagined. Even the tremendous thunderstorms that you probably get in Texas.
I was going to say, because I actually originally thought of it as, Bilbo having been sheltered. Mm-hmm. Bilbo's just lived in a place like, I don't know, like Southern California that has such great weather all the time. But I think you're probably right. I think because we are, we're supposed to inhabit the character of Bilbo. I think it is supposed to be beyond our imagination. And certainly the description here is, it's phenomenal, isn't it? I mean, such great language used here. The lightning splinters, the rocks shiver.
And even the crashes, the sound, it splits the air and it goes rolling and tumbling. A sound goes rolling and tumbling. And the overwhelming noise, the sudden light. Yeah, I mean, this is a vivid image. And,
even this expression "thunder battle" just has a very Germanic feel to it. Although
it does, doesn't it?
I know "battle" is a Latin root word, but it just sounds, it sounds medieval. Thunder battle. Thunder battle.
It sounds like something that you'd see at some, Renaissance festival. We're going to have a thunder battle at 4:00. Be sure to bring your whatevers. But and it would of course
reminds me a little of a Rush song too. Actually, the Jacob's Ladder.
Oh yeah.
The clouds prepare for battle.
That's right. Boy, you really pulled that one out of a hat. It took me a little while to reference that in my head.
I was listening to that album just earlier this week. But.
Good man. This is quite a storm. This is beyond. We get some pretty big storms down here, but nothing like you guys get in Texas. Of course,
know you guys do.
No, we just have to deal with earthquakes.
Right.
Going back, there's a line here that I really wanted to touch on. That no king ruled. Now, part of that is part of the fear of the mountains is that there's no king here. I couldn't help but recall in Roast Mutton, just the last chapter, when Some of the dwarves, talking about these dangerous lands, said they have seldom even heard of the king around here, kind of implying that this lack of knowledge of the king, or maybe even lack of submission to the king, is a bad thing. And we see the same thing in Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit saying, quote, of wild folk and wicked things such as trolls, that they had not heard of the king, for they attributed to the king of old all their essential laws. And usually they kept the laws of free will because they were the rules, as they said, both ancient and just. So
it's kind of a reference to the fact that this used to be Númenorian country. This used to be part of Arnor.
Arnor, right.
Yeah, this is a land that has been civilized in the past.
And it is not now.
It's
kind of an anarchic state, you know.
Yeah. It's a great phrase.
It is.
It's just so full of meaning. You know, there's so much wrapped up in, you know, you get the idea of lawlessness, you get the idea of uncivilized, you get the idea of you're on your own.
Yeah, you've got nothing to protect you, nobody to call on.
Yeah, nothing to protect you. There's no recourse. You're not going to be able to take somebody to court or, you know, take them before some higher authority to arbitrate some issue. Yeah,
you're just going to be eaten. Yeah.
Right.
By an Ettin.
Ooh, nicely done.
Eaten by an Ettin.
Some wordplay.
Yeah. This is an interesting thing, and I really wanted to point it out because I think for a lot of our listeners, you know, about 2/3 of our audience is here in America. You know, we don't think of kings as necessarily a good thing. You know,
that's true.
We come from a nation that said we don't want a king. We want a president. We want representation. So, you know, to think of the king as being kind of an indication of decency, of civilization, like you said, of the rule of law. It's really important to kind of point that out, I think. But
yeah, now that's a good catch because it's a bit contrary to usual American, you know, sympathies. And,
a lot of Tolkien is, though. You know, we get a lot of this. You know how we've observed that fellowship and community is really important. And we're about as individualistic a culture as there is.
That's true.
In a good way for the most part, but it's it does have its drawbacks.
Well, but that's what's great about Tolkien is that it balances.
It really does.
It balances so much of our modern tendencies.
And you hit it on the head right there. It's modern. It's a modern thing. And his worldview and his creation is very, very medieval, and that's a very different value set.
Just the title of the last book of the Lord of the Rings being the Return of the King. You know, that is a very there's obviously some apocalyptic undertones or overtones to that, but still that is about the restoration of a monarchy and how that makes the world a better place.
Place.
But obviously, you know, we see the essential truth of that even if we do not live in a monarchy ourselves.
Exactly. Now, before we have you read Thorin's next lines, there's the paragraph that we want to touch on and go pretty deep into, is this fight between the stone giants. They're hurling rocks, they're catching them, they're throwing them into the dark, they're smashing them among the trees, they're guffawing and shouting. Okay, stone giants. Now, we started our show today with that philology segment on philology. Hey, I said philology, so now I got to do this. Okay, so we started our show today with that philology segment on toys. Don't give me toys
and
tell
music.
me not
I can listen to it all day.
You know, it's great. I'll just put it on loop for you. With that segment on the words for trolls and giants, which referenced the note in Anderson's Annotated Hobbit. Now, that note was actually in reference to this passage, but we saved the part that was relevant to this passage for this part of our discussion. Anderson says specifically, the stone giants are mentioned only in the Hobbit. It seems probable that they can be interpreted as a type of troll. Both are large and apparently malicious beings, and in Appendix F of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien mentions as a type of troll the stone trolls of the Westlands, who spoke a debased form of the common speech. And this description certainly applies to good old Bert, Tom, and Will.
Debased form indeed.
Debased indeed. It's not drawing room fashion at all.
And Bill's purse. Let's not forget Bill's purse.
You.
Yeah, who are you?
Well done. So Anderson seems to think that these stone giants are, you're welcome, potentially the same creatures that we just saw in Chapter 2, but that Tolkien's using a different name for them, or that if they're not exactly the same, they're related in terms of origin and nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is possible. Certainly given the etymological connection that we discussed in that earlier segment. I do kind of wonder if they were meant to be exactly the same creature, then why would Tolkien use a different name for the same creature in the same book just a few pages later, and then not explain that it's the same creature? But there's certainly the likelihood of some kind of connection. This is a place where, unfortunately, Rateliff's research doesn't give us much of an answer either.
No.
Looking in the history of The Hobbit, there actually is, he's got those essays that are between manuscript segments, and one of those is on the giants. And he starts that essay by saying, if the goblins open up a vast array of questions, the giants, glimpsed from a distance during the crossing of the Misty Mountains, remain on the fringes of the story. Mm-hmm. And boy, truer words were never spoken.
Yeah.
He points out that, despite what Anderson says, actually giants occur in several of Tolkien's works, but we never learn a great deal about them.
Almost
Rateliff
nothing.
Mentioned, nothing, yeah. Rateliff mentions that there are some references to giants in the Tale of Tinuviel in the Book of Lost Tales, which admittedly is probably too early, to count.
Yeah,
I mean, we generally kind of consider that one sort of a rough draft that's superseded by later stuff.
Right.
But there are also giants in the Lay of Leithian, which we've discussed was written just prior to when Tolkien started work on The Hobbit. And we talked earlier about how Treebeard started out as a giant, even as late as the composition of Lord of the Rings. So there definitely were giants somewhere in Tolkien's mind as he's writing all this stuff. I don't think that they necessarily have to be the same thing as trolls, although maybe, based on some of the philological stuff we discussed earlier, maybe trolls were to be considered a type of giant. Maybe giants are...
That's kind of what I'm... like a subtype of some sort.
Right, exactly. Giants are this wide-ranging class of not necessarily related creatures, and trolls are a subset of that.
Right.
And, some of the stuff we talked about earlier even suggests that maybe he was thinking of trolls as stone giants, and ents were tree giants or wood giants or something like that.
Oh, okay, like elemental giants of some sort.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, as to whether or not that's where he landed on it, we just don't know. But that does seem to have been the case at some point.
That's an interesting point. I'm trying to think about that. There's a type of giant. That seems to be a better fit for me. I mean, philologically they're related. Maybe we need to do a Venn diagram like we did for the wolves, werewolves, and wargs.
For wolves and werewolves, and
we could do it for the giants.
Yeah.
But one thing seems to be clear: there really are actual giants. Now, I say that because we've seen it suggested that maybe Bilbo was seeing an optical illusion, or his mind was playing tricks on him, and that there are no giants in Tolkien's world. But we can really, really rule that out. I mean, not only does Thorin refer to giants directly in the next passage that you're going to read, and Gandalf talks about later on getting a more or less decent giant to block the entrance to the Goblin Cave later in chapter 6, I think.
That's right. Yeah, and I think you mentioned that he doesn't just see it; he hears noises and things like that.
Yeah.
He hears guffawing. So I agree. I definitely think there's something there. And I just think really Tolkien himself wasn't quite sure what giants were or what was a giant and what wasn't. Right up until the point when he invented Treebeard.
Yeah.
And called Treebeard a decent giant in the plot sketch of Lord of the Rings. So
Gandalf's going to have a hard time getting Treebeard to come all the way up here, though. He's going to have to find a local decent giant.
He's going to have to find another decent giant, a local decent giant.
Hey, Treebeard, check your LinkedIn. Do you have anybody up here?
Does anybody know a decent giant?
He's going to look up on Yelp.
In the 06 zip code?
He's looking up on Yelp.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Looking for it. Oh, no. I know. I got this guy Treebeard down in Fangorn, but he doesn't come north of the...
Yeah. No, never that far.
Whichever river. I don't have my map in front of me. But...
So, I have to say there is a passage earlier about the boulders coming galloping down the mountainsides, and then we see that here again with the rocks being hurled. This was something where this was really based on something that happened in Tolkien's actual life, and I wanted to reference this because I thought it was a really fascinating thing. Yeah. It comes to us out of letter 306, which he wrote to his oldest son, Michael. And he even says to him specifically that Bilbo's journey is based on his adventures in Switzerland in 1911. He talks about a group of 12 that he was with, including his brother, strung out single file going up a glacier in Switzerland. And here's the quote from the letter. The summer of that year had melted away much snow, and stones and boulders were exposed that, I suppose, were normally covered. The heat of the day continued the melting, and we were alarmed to see many of them starting to roll down the slope at gathering speed, anything from the size of oranges to large footballs, and a few much larger. They were whizzing across our path and plunging into the ravine. They started slowly and then usually held a straight line of descent, but the path was rough, and one had also to keep an eye on one's feet. I remember the member of the party just in front of me, an elderly schoolmistress, gave a sudden squeak and jumped forward as a large lump of rock shot between us, about a foot at most before my unmanly knees. I can't even imagine that sort of an experience.
Wow.
Kind of dangerous.
Right. I do remember reading that.
Yeah.
That had to be scary.
That had to be very scary, especially for that poor elderly schoolmistress. But, we're talking pretty sizable rocks. I mean, even an orange-sized rock coming all the way down the glacier at you, that's gonna leave a mark if that hits you.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Now, that's probably more related to the passage we read earlier because they're described as being let loose by midday sun upon the snow. But it came to mind because we were thinking about these rocks being hurled at each other. So it made me think of the danger.
I think it's definitely, appropriate to the scene. And I'm thinking back to this line about how Bilbo had never seen or imagined anything of the kind. I can imagine, young J.R.R. seeing this for the first time. And well, the fact that he refers to his unmanly knees. That suggests that maybe there was some quivering and crying involved there.
I bet. Oh man, I mean 1911, so he's fairly young at this point.
He would have been 19.
Yeah, I think so. Well, it was the summer of, might have still, that sounds about right, somewhere in that range.
Yeah,
I mean he wasn't a child, but he was still a young enough man that he hadn't seen a lot of things.
He was still a pup,
Yeah, that's about right. So Thorin doesn't like these giants any more than Bilbo. Great. What does he have to say, or what's his plan?
All right, this won't do at all, said Thorin. If we don't get blown off or drowned or struck by lightning, we shall be picked up by some giant and kicked sky high for a football. Well, if you know of anywhere better, take us there, said Gandalf, who was feeling very grumpy and was far from happy about the giants himself. The end of their argument was that they sent Fili and Kili to look for a better shelter.
Why do you send the hot dwarves to look for a better shelter? Why send the hot dwarves?
Well, I'll tell you why.
There you go.
They had very sharp eyes, and they weren't just dreamy to look at.
I was going to say, some might say dreamy, but...
You could get lost in those eyes. Let me start that paragraph over again.
Sorry.
The end of their argument was that they sent Fili and Kili to look for a better shelter. They had very sharp eyes, and being the youngest of the dwarves by some 50 years, they usually got these sort of jobs, when everybody could see that it was absolutely no use sending Bilbo.
Well, yeah.
There is nothing like looking if you want to find something, or so Thorin said to the young dwarves. You certainly usually find something if you look, but it is not always quite the something you are after. So it proved on this occasion. Soon, Fili and Kili came crawling back, holding on to the rocks in the wind. We have found a dry cave, they said, not far around the next corner, and ponies and all could get inside. Have you thoroughly explored it? Said the wizard, who knew that caves up in the mountains were seldom unoccupied. Yes, they said, though everybody knew they could not have been long about it. They had come back too quick. It isn't all that big, and it does not go far back.
Well, that was their problem. They should have just hung out there and, played a game of cards. And yeah, we fully explored that cave, man. I'm telling you.
That would have been smart.
That would have been. But they were the youngest dwarves, so, Now I think I get why people think they were the hot dwarves. They were the youngest of the dwarves by 50 years.
By 50 years?
In other words, they only looked good because of who they were with. I mean, you and I would look good in a room if we were hanging out with a bunch of 80-year-olds.
Yeah, that's true.
We're going to look like the hot dwarves.
And that's saying something.
And that really is saying
something.
I mean, that's a stretch, but yeah.
Yeah. Except for Balin. Balin aged very well.
Like a fine wine.
Valen is a fine cheese.
Oh, goodness. Some great stuff here. I love the line about there's nothing like looking if you want to find something.
Isn't that cool?
A pretty obvious statement.
That's a neat little bit of wisdom.
Yeah, it is.
You know?
It really is.
It's not always what you were looking for, but you'll find something.
You'll find something.
I like that.
That's true. Good stuff. And then Gandalf's...
We got Thorin's football comment.
Yeah. So he obviously saw the giants, and Gandalf did as well.
Yeah.
He's feeling grumpy and far from happy about the giants himself.
Yeah.
Why doesn't he do something about it? I mean, he is a wizard after all, but, he's not that kind of wizard.
Well, right. I'm not that kind of wizard.
He's not going to cast spells and knock the giants down from their perches.
Delayed blast fireball.
There you go. That's exactly what you need. Oh, man. So,
yeah.
But his wisdom...
No, it's interesting. We get another bit of his wisdom.
Yeah.
He knows that caves up here are seldom unoccupied.
Yeah, what a rare treasure that is, I mean...
He's traveled.
Even if it's not a goblin,
he knows.
even if it's just a wolf or a bear, I mean, there are going to be creatures who are
true.
taking shelter in a storm and away from the storm giants in the mountains, in the caves, I should say.
Yeah.
And the odds of it being truly unoccupied are pretty slim.
Yeah.
So, and sure
there's
enough,
almost I almost feel like there's not quite, I almost feel like there's almost a fourth wall break with this next line, the dangerous part about caves.
Oh yeah, that is.
You don't know how far they go back sometimes. It's certainly a kind of a nudge at the fourth wall.
It is a nudge at the fourth wall. He's clearly talking to the reader, that of course, especially that of course part. That's kind of like it made me think of that is of course absurd. He's telling you. This is an obvious thing, and if you don't know that it's obvious, I'm going to tell you that it's obvious, so you say, "Oh, that's obvious."
Right. Yeah.
Because of course the children who are reading this may not know that that's the dangerous part about caves. So he's just trying to tell them that if you were older and had worldly experience, you would know, of course, that this is the dangerous part. So
that's a good point. Yeah. So he's kind of using it's kind of a teachable moment. Yeah. For the young audience, yeah.
For the youth that are reading his book. And he's right. You don't know how far the cave goes back, especially if you're talking about smaller creatures that might live in there. A bear certainly needs a pretty big, wide passage, but wouldn't be surprised if, wolves might not need as big a space.
Right.
You just never know what's in there, so... But,
right.
They had really no other choice. What are they going to do? Stay outside and get hit by a rock thrown by the giants? I mean, they're going to go in there, even if they don't know.
It's true, yeah. And it even says, for now, their news seemed good enough.
Yeah, good enough.
It's like, okay, it's something.
Exactly.
Let's go there. Yeah.
So they get in, and it's a little bit tight. They got to get the ponies through. They had to take off the packs and saddles to get them through. So it was a slightly, low arch. Mm-hmm. But once they're inside, they're pretty pleased. They're out of the wind, they're out of the rain. They don't seem to be in danger of the storm giants anymore. And Gandalf does his little, lighting the match at the top of his wand.
Yeah, little wand
where
trick
he
there.
blows from the movie.
Yeah.
So
I always thought that was a cool effect.
It was a nice little touch. You wonder if that was directed or something that Ian McKellen decided he'd throw out there.
Yeah.
But so they went ahead and explored it, and sure enough. I'll go ahead and read the next little bit. It seemed quite a fair size, but not too large and mysterious. It had a dry floor and some comfortable nooks. At one end there was room for the ponies, and there they stood, mighty glad of the change, steaming and champing in their nosebags. Owen and Glóin wanted to light a fire at the door to dry their clothes, but Gandalf would not hear of it. So they spread out their wet things on the floor and got dry ones out of their bundles. Then they made their blankets comfortable, got out their pipes and blew smoke. Okay, hold on. They got out their pipes and blew smoke rings, which means they lit matches or whatever, not matches, but tinder and flint, I guess. But they weren't allowed to light a fire to dry their clothes.
Well, I think, you could light a pipe, but
That's
you have
smaller
a pretty
fire.
Small flame inside a pipe bowl. And
That's true.
It wouldn't necessarily be something you would see
big
from
old
afar.
Campfire
like a big
at the door,
fire.
right.
Yeah, like a big campfire right at the door. That would be something
yeah.
wargs and goblins would see for miles around.
Definitely. So this is basically like a dwarf slumber party. They're,
oh, yeah.
So Gandalf...
Oh, they're having a grand old time
they're
here.
big old time. So we'll get back to the rest of the paragraph. They blew smoke rings, which Gandalf turned into different colors and set dancing up by the roof to amuse them. They talked and talked and braided each other's hair. No, I'm sorry. And forgot about the storm and discussed what each would do with his share of the treasure when they got it, which at the moment did not seem so impossible. And so they dropped off to sleep one by one. And that was the last time that they used the ponies, packages, baggages, tools, and paraphernalia that they had brought with them. Yeah.
Boy, there's a lot in that paragraph.
There really is a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the description of the cave itself, fair size, but, not too big, dry floor, comfortable nooks. Yeah. So you got the ponies at one
I think it's important that it's a dry floor.
Yes, yes.
Remember, that faintly recalls the description of Bilbo's hole as not a nasty, dirty, wet hole? This one is also not a wet hole. And, it's homey enough for a hobbit, for at least in the current situation.
Yeah. I mean, this is a sandy bare hole with nothing to sit down on or...
Right.
But it's definitely not a hobbit hole, but it is at least not a wet floor, which is important.
Right. Yeah.
Ponies over on the side, they're sitting there, their breath steaming and champing at their food. Owen and Glóin, who failed to light a fire earlier, want to show that they can still do the task. Gandalf says no. I love that they made their blankets comfortable. This is, they're getting snugged up in bed. They're getting ready to sleep. They're exhausted. I can't even imagine how exhausted they are. For once, probably the first time since they left the homely house, a week or two ago, here they are actually in shelter.
They've got some good shelter, and but then they get too comfortable, don't they?
They do. They don't set up a watch.
Nope.
They have a little fun with Gandalf. He turns their smoke rings into colors, and it's a little entertainment time. They talked and talked.
Can't blame them for having a little fun.
No, of course not.
Talking and talking, which means it's going on for a long time.
Yeah, late into the night, apparently. Far enough that they forgot about the storm.
They forgot, that's interesting because remember, the storm was why they were in the cave in the first place.
Yeah.
But you think they would be watching the storm and thinking,
when does this thing end so we can move forward if we...
Exactly, yeah.
And then they do what I kind of do whenever I see the lottery get into some really ridiculous amount. They start discussing what they're going to do with their share of the treasure. Disclaimer, I never actually buy a ticket, but I'll spend half an hour on the freeway thinking about what I'd spend the money on.
Just thinking about it, yeah. Spending that jackpot you'll never get, yeah. Spending the treasure they haven't even won yet. That's a classic.
That's
a classic of wish fulfillment.
Boy, isn't it?
And it all sounds great. It sounds like they're having a good time. It sounds like exactly the kind of adventure Bilbo really thought he was getting when he left his door. But really what's happening here is they're getting careless.
They are. They don't set a watch.
They're letting their guard down.
That's the biggest thing.
Really, they kind of deserve what's about to happen to them, don't they?
Well, yeah. I mean, it certainly. I don't know how good.
I know it's harsh, but I mean,
yeah.
But they're just not paying attention,
Yeah, and you wonder if they had put a guard up, whether that would have been, how much earlier this could have been stopped. Because by the time, as we're about to see, it doesn't really get stopped in time. But why don't you go ahead and take that next, paragraph in a bit?
But before I do, I want to point out one more thing in that last sentence. The last time that they had used the ponies, packages, baggages, tools, and paraphernalia that they had brought with them, a lot of people wonder what happened to the musical instruments.
Yeah. This would be where they went.
People sometimes think
if they made it this far.
Exactly. Yeah. People sometimes say, "Oh, maybe they left them in Bilbo's hole because we never see them again." I think they had them on the ponies and they disappeared into a goblin cave.
Yep.
I think paraphernalia certainly includes harps.
Oh yeah, almost certainly. I could look that
Just
up.
wanted to throw
Paraphernalia, does that include harps?
Paraphernalia, yeah, exactly. It's
vials
right
as
there
big
in
as
the definition.
themselves. A drum. Certainly flutes.
And harps, golden harps.
Yes.
All fall under
and root harps.
We should do a paraphernalia Venn diagram also.
That would be one very large circle. Oh, goodness.
All right. Well, now I'll take this next passage.
All right. Sounds good.
It turned out a good thing that night that they had brought little Bilbo with them, after all. For somehow he could not go to sleep for a long while. And when he did sleep, he had very nasty dreams. He dreamed that a crack in the wall at the back of the cave got bigger and bigger, and opened wider and wider. And he was very afraid, but could not call out or do anything but lie and look. Then he dreamed that the floor of the cave was giving way, and he was slipping, beginning to fall down, goodness knows where to. At that he woke up with a horrible start, and found that part of his dream was true. A crack had opened at the back of the cave and was already a wide passage. He was just in time to see the last of the pony's tails disappearing into it.
Well, that's barely just in time.
Yeah,
I wouldn't call that just in time, but yeah.
No, I'd call that a moment too late.
That would be. We're not reading that, but he does yell next, which is apparently rather loud for the size of a hobbit.
Yeah. And his first actual contribution to the company.
Yeah, isn't it? That's what I was going to say. He's got this, he kind of blew it with the trolls, going beyond his job description and causing all sorts of danger. But it turned out a good thing that they had brought him with them.
Yeah.
His dream ends up being what saves them a little bit. Because again, though we're not going to read it, we find out that his yell had woke Gandalf, and he was able to at least do something. We see that there's a terrific flash like lightning, a smell of gunpowder, and several of the orcs, or goblins, I should say, fell dead. And we'll find out later that Gandalf was obviously able to get away. But in the meantime, they have been captured. Big old goblins. I love the description. Big, great, ugly-looking, lots. 6 to a dwarf and even 2 for Bilbo. And here's where we got that Tinder and Flint joke, apparently, that they all came in and carried them off through the crack before he could say Tinder and Flint.
I love that. I love the Tinder and Flint and the rocks and blocks. I don't know.
Rocks and blocks.
They're just little fun little phrases that
I agree.
really distract from the terror of the scene.
Exactly. And very much the kind of thing he does when it comes to these scary moments. He tries to find a way to make them a little bit less threatening to the young reader. Even though, this is a pretty bad situation. I would say a very bad situation, actually.
Very bad situation.
But interesting how the movie adapted this to turn into the floor opening up like it did in his dream, when in the book it's just the back of the cave opening up with a crack. Certainly a little more practical. Right. I'm going to go ahead and read a little bit here. I'm going to read right up to the beginning of the poetry, and that is where we're going to end our discussion for tonight. So, they seized Bilbo and the dwarves and hurried them along. It was deep, deep dark, such as only goblins that have taken to living in the heart of the mountains can see through. The passages there were crossed and tangled in all directions, but the goblins knew their way, as well as you do, to the nearest post office. And the way went down and down, and it was most horribly stuffy. The goblins were very rough, and pinched unmercifully, and chuckled and laughed in their horrible stony voices. And Bilbo was more unhappy even than when the troll had picked him up by his toes. He wished again and again for his nice bright hobbit hole, not for the last time. Now there came a glimmer of a red light before them. The goblins began to sing or croak, keeping time with the flap of their flat feet on the stone and shaking their prisoners as well. And we'll have to leave it off there, but my goodness, such vivid descriptions here. The darkness, the deep, deep dark, and that only a goblin who'd taken to living in the heart of the mountain could see through. It's that dark. And yet the goblins knew their way. And here's another one of those references, right? This is kind of like, this isn't as humorous maybe as Rocks and Blocks or Tinder and Flint, but, it's another one of these nods to the audience, a breaking of the fourth wall. That they know their way like you do to the nearest post office. Yeah,
exactly. I think that's cool for a couple of reasons. The fourth wall break, but also, you think about it, because I love to just dig deep on some of these word choices. Why this image?
Right.
Post offices are, they're kind of a civilizing fact. Well, very much a civilizing factor. We use them to organize our mail, organize our neighborhoods. We even think of, certainly in the United States, we think of postal codes as a physical area. Post offices are a way that we organize and civilize ourselves. But goblins, we're told, are at home in these crossed and tangled tunnels. They're disorderly people who are at home in a disorderly space. And I think that says a lot about them.
I think it does. And I think it tells a lot about you that's what you caught from it. Because for me, I was reminded of the line in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when he's talking about space is big, really big, mind-blowingly big. You may think it's a long way down the street to the chemist, but that's peanuts to space. So I
Nice.
was thinking of The Chemist.
That's
Which,
awesome.
of course, is a pharmacy. I think when I first
Yes,
read that,
yeah.
I was like, I don't know, maybe 14.
What?
I was like,
Really? There's
what in
a
the
chemistry
world is
lab
a
down the street?
chemist?
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm picturing some guy in a white lab coat with some test tubes.
Right. Right.
But that's what it made me think. Of course, you know the way down there, and you might think that's a long way, but yeah. Most horribly stuffy.
Just another way that this world just kind of leaps off the page and just becomes
It really does.
so much more than anything that we know.
Yeah, that is true. This is beyond our experience, and he's trying to reference a little bit of our experience. That's why the
Right.
post office line is there, but to show us that this is beyond. This is something that we can't experience. This like the goblins do. The goblins know their way, but you could never find your way.
Right.
And of course, they were, the air was miserable, horribly stuffy. The goblins are rough. I thought it was funny that their voices are described as stony. I mean, there's nothing to link them with the stone giants or the trolls, but it certainly seems to tie them together a little bit.
I want to say, you remember in Morgoth's Ring, there's that whole series of essays on the origins of orcs, and
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, it never
I
really
think at one
lands
point,
anywhere.
very early on, I think he abandoned it really early, but I think maybe somewhere in maybe the Book of Lost Tales, I think he thought they might have a stone.
Some
They
sort
might
of a
have
stone
sort of an
origin.
affinity. They might have come from stone or something like that. I
Okay.
think. I don't know.
Like
I
an
have to look
animated
into
sort
that one.
of, yeah.
Yeah.
There are so many different origins for orcs. And
Yeah, there are, and I want to be really clear. I mean, if he ever associated them with stone, it was really, really early. So
Yeah.
it probably would have been something that he was already getting over by the time
he would
wrote
have
The
abandoned.
Hobbit. But
Yeah. And then, of course, we get Bilbo wishing again and again for his nice, bright Hobbit hole, and not for the last time, and not for the first
last
time.
His nice.
How many times is
bright-
that by now? Is this at least the third time that we get him wishing for his nice Hobbit hole?
It's at least the third, and it might be the fourth. Yeah,
That's somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Really,
It's
it's
a
not
nice,
surprising.
bright Hobbit hole.
Yes, because it's always opposite of what it's in, right? I mean, the
True,
wishing,
yeah.
I think, if we look back, here he's in darkness, and so he's wishing for the brightness.
Right.
In roast mutton, bother burgling, I wish I was at home in my nice hole by the fire with the kettle beginning to sing. That's in the middle of rain. It's tea time, or it's after tea time, and they haven't had food, but he wants the tea boiling. So, I mean, it's very much, whatever they're in, they want
He's
the opposite.
always wishing for the opposite of whatever miserable
Horrible
situation
experience he's in,
Yeah,
which
right.
is not unreasonable.
Which is reasonable, yeah.
It's exactly what I do. It's just and that's a reminder, I think, that we identify with this character. That if you were here, you would be wishing for your comfortable home.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, very much so.
and then we get that really cool little hint of what's coming, the glimmer of red light, and then the beginning of the song, which we'll get to next time.
Yep.
But for now, that was a great discussion. And folks, we really want to encourage you. Please join us again next week when we finish up this chapter. A big thanks to our Patreon family who has made it possible for us to release these episodes weekly.
That's right, and you really are going to want to tune in next time so that you can see what happens when you bring an ancient elvish sword to a goblin fight.
That's not a knife. That's a knife. That's right. Now, before we see what Bartleman has for us, we want to take a minute to ask you to consider joining our Patreon family at patreon.com/prancingponypod if we've earned your support. Sean and I each sink several hours, I don't know, 6 or 8, and it used to be 10 when we were doing touring,
something like that, yeah.
into each and every episode. And we really are happy to do it, but we're really grateful for the resources you provide. It's thanks to our Patreon family that we've been able to move to weekly episodes, but we have another big goal that's quite a ways off, and we're just a little over halfway there. And of course, we have some really cool rewards, too, like exclusive content.
In fact, one of the bits of exclusive content that our patrons have access to is a 10 to 15 minute postscript to each episode.
That's about right.
We record episodes what was that?
I said that's about right, 10 to 15 minutes.
Yeah. Right around 10,
I think we started with 5 to 10, and it's become
Right,
closer
yeah,
to
and we
15.
ended up at 10 to 15. Yeah, we might dial it back, but, who are we kidding? We're us.
Yeah, we digress.
But what those are is, since we record episodes a couple of weeks in advance, we get a chance to listen to them before they release. And so we see if there are any jokes we missed out on or anything we want to explore more, dig into a little bit more, things like that.
Absolutely. So we record that special Patreon exclusive postscript that usually releases the same day as the episode it follows. So if you want access to those bonuses, be sure to join the Fellowship of the Podcast. We also want to take a minute to thank those of you who've already joined. You really are helping to make this show even better. And let's not forget a very special shout out to Maya in Michigan and Jason in British Columbia, our patrons at the Kierdance contribution tier. Folks, if you want a personalized shout out on our episodes, now you know where to go.
Yeah, and while your support is really appreciated, we do not want you to feel obligated.
That's right.
Only support us if you can afford it, and only if you think we've earned it do we want you to consider signing up. Otherwise, just keep listening and keep enjoying the podcast because we'll keep making it.
That is absolutely right. So, Sean, do we have any questions in Bartleman's bag this time around?
We have a few that we're going to try and get through tonight.
Actually, I kind of knew that. That's why,
Yeah.
I mean, how often do we actually wrap our discussion up at, a little after an hour?
Right. Yeah, definitely some fun ones we want to get through. First of all, we've got a priority access question from Mike R. in Pennsylvania, which I'm glad we got now because it fits with the recent Halloween festivities since this episode is releasing just a few days after Halloween.
Yeah.
Mike wrote in asking, why did the souls of the slain elves in the Dead Marshes not go to Valinor?
Ooh.
So I have an answer for this one that's nice and spooky, and I want to give it. But first, I think we need to go back and look first at the description of the Dead Marshes that we get in the Two Towers. And Alan, I want to let you take this one because, frankly, I just want to hear your Gollum voice.
I've been hesitant to try to break out the Gollum voice because I think I mentioned this recently. I don't want to do an imitation of Andy Serkis.
I know you don't.
He's nailed it, and it's really hard to avoid it. But I'll do my best to give it some sort of independence. He set the bar
so high.
Oh my goodness, I'm not gonna. Yeah, I just hope to be in the same universe. Other than that, though, I love this reading, so I can't wait. This is from Book 4, Chapter 2 of the Two Towers. Sam falls, and his face almost touches the water in the marshes, and the text says, "For a moment, the water below him looked like some window, glazed with grimy glass through which he was peering. Wrenching his hands out of the bog, he sprang back with a cry. 'There are dead things! Dead faces in the water!' he said with horror. 'Dead faces!' Frodo says, 'I know not who they are, but I thought I saw their men and elves and orcs beside them.' And Gollum explains. 'Yes,' said Gollum. 'All dead, all rotten. Elves and men and orcs, the Dead Marshes. There was a great battle long ago. Yes, so they told him when Smeagol was young. When I was young before the Precious came. It was a great battle. Tall men with long swords and terrible elves and orcs shrieking.' But then we get this exchange. 'But that is an age and more ago,' said Sam. 'The dead can't really be there. Is it some devilry hatched in the Darkland?' 'Who knows? Smeagol doesn't know,' answered Gollum. So, Sean, what do you draw from this? Besides that my Smeagol needs work.
I thought it was a very good start.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
I was right there.
It's fun.
Well, so back to Mike's question. Why did the souls not go to Valinor, if they did not go to Valinor?
Right.
So we know that there are elves' faces there, or that they see elves' faces, or they see faces. And the fact that they're called rotting or rotten suggests that there's actually bodies lying there in the marsh where they died, and I think they're decomposing slowly. I think the marsh. Or maybe the evil that lies over the land, but certainly the marsh itself could have some embalming effect on the bodies. I mean, there are bog mummies in I think in the north of Britain.
Okay.
So there could actually be bodies there that are decomposing at a slow rate, and so they could actually be seeing faces there. But I'm digressing because that's not the question we were asked. We were asked about the souls, not the bodies. But I'm still on the Halloween high. I would say we don't know for a fact that the elf souls are there. We know the lights are there, and that something very strange is going on. I have to point out that the only explanation we really get for it is from Gollum, and that is not very clear. He's not exactly the most trustworthy, person to explain this, I don't think.
No.
But let's go ahead and assume that the place is haunted by elf souls, because frankly, it's just more fun. There's really not much to explain it in The War of the Rings, which is the volume of History of Middle-earth that deals with the composition of this chapter. All that I found there that was interesting was that Tolkien was inspired to create this scene and, have these lights shining in the bog by this folklore idea of will-o'-the-wisps, which are also called jack-o'-lanterns.
Oh, okay. Is this another almost like we planned it that way moment? Because they're not going to believe us much longer,
I know, yeah. Wow, jack-o'-lanterns now. It's well done,
How
Sean.
convenient.
How convenient. But yeah, I think a lot of people have heard of will-o'-the-wisp, certainly. Will-o'-the-wisp certainly still has the same meaning that it once did, although jack-o'-lantern has kind of become something very different.
True.
But these were lights that were seen in bogs and marshes that were explained as elemental spirits or fairies or the like. And I would say, although Tolkien was inspired by these, and he actually did use the phrase will-o'-the-wisp in those early drafts, he also called them corpse candles early on, which is a folk term for the same phenomenon seen in a graveyard. So
I'm just picturing like a birthday cake, except it's a dead body with a bunch of candles. Who's going to blow that out?
Ew. Oh, man. That's awful.
Terrible image.
It's great, but it's awful. Boy.
Sorry, I didn't mean to throw you off.
No, that's fine. I love it. It's exactly the kind of gruesome thing I'm in the mood for.
Happy Death Day to you.
Nicely done. Nicely done. So yeah, he was definitely thinking of them as associated with the dead very early on. Calling them these corpse candles. Anyway, I just wanted to share all that stuff because of the time of year. In reality, the answer to Mike's question is found in Laws and Customs Among the Eldar in Morgoth's Ring.
Man, I
where
love
we
that
find
essay.
this. Yeah. So we find this passage in there. The Fea, and remember, that's the soul of the elves.
Oh, yeah, we haven't talked about that in a while.
We have not talked about it in a while, which is why I wanted to go ahead and define it for anybody who's maybe just picked up at the Hobbit. Sometimes we'll use the word Fea and Hroa. Fea is the soul of elves.
Or
and
Fear
Hroa
would be
is
the plural.
The body.
Yeah.
Right. Fear and Hroar would be the plural. So in this passage, Tolkien says, "The Fea is single, and in the last impregnable. It cannot be brought to Mandos. It is summoned, and the summons proceeds from just authority, and is imperative, yet it may be refused." Tolkien goes on to say that elves of the Avari kindreds actually frequently refuse the summons, but that the Eldar, at least we can infer that the Eldar generally did not, except that he does say later, he says, "But it would seem that in these after days more and more of the elves, be they of the Eldalia in origin, or be they of other kinds, who linger in Middle-earth, now refuse the summons of Mandos, and wander houseless in the world, unwilling to leave it and unable to inhabit it, haunting trees or springs or hidden places that once they knew. Not all of these are kindly or unstained by the shadow. Indeed, the refusal of the summons is in itself a sign of taint." So, if there were spirits of elves there on the plain of Dagorlad, that what became the Dead Marshes, if those elves had died there, those spirits would actually have been summoned back to the halls of Mandos upon death. But they don't go back automatically. They have a choice to stay or to leave. Sometimes the spirits do linger, and it could be that some of those who died in that battle died unwilling to leave. And so I would say if there are elf souls there, I would say that would be an explanation for them. What do you think?
Well, you kind of took away my phone when you said "if," because I thought you were landing that there were. If you did, then,
oh no,
this might be where those listeners who want us to disagree, they might finally have gotten their wish. Because I remember that according to the laws and customs of the Eldar, that and you touched on this, that the refusal of the summons.
I'll put out there that I think it's fun to believe that they actually are there. Okay. So yeah, I'm saying if, but I'm on the side of they are. Okay. So you can still have your fun with me.
Oh, good. Now I can disagree with you. All right, so you touched on this earlier. The refusal of the summons to Mandos in the halls of waiting is frequent among those who decline the invitation of the Valar to Amon. We're talking about the Avari, the dark elves, or not the elves of the light, not the Eldar. So right after that, though, we learn that refusal was rare when Sauron was in Arda. Now, you talked about that.
That is true.
In these after days, more and more of the elves who linger now refuse the summons. When Tolkien's saying that, he's talking about the now. He's talking about elves who are still around. He's not talking about when Sauron was around. In fact, he says specifically that when Sauron was around and Morgoth before him, then the Fëa unbodied would flee in terror of the shadow to any refuge, unless it were already committed to the darkness and passed then into its dominion. So then these elves
it's
the elves that fought in the Last Alliance were not Avari, who maybe would be prone to refusing the summons, and nor were these corrupt elves under the dominion of the shadow. That's true. They would not have been. I mean, they're the exact opposite. Right. These are high elves under the command of Gil-galad. So, I have a hard time buying the notion that after giving their lives in the Last Alliance, they would somehow refuse the summons, because that would mean refusing to be rehoused. So I tend to think that these are elf bodies rotting in the bogs, and that these lights, these corpse candles, are mere tricks of Sauron. But we also get this from that same exchange that you had me read earlier, and I really found this intriguing. Back when Sam asks Gollum if this is some devilry hatched in the dark land, Gollum admitted he didn't know, but then he offers this chilling detail. You cannot reach them. You cannot touch them. We tried once, yes, precious. I tried once, but you cannot reach them. Only shapes to see, perhaps, not to touch. No, precious, all dead. Aha, you cannot reach them, you cannot touch them. So perhaps they didn't even see elf bodies, just some evil illusion of death, the vision of faces under the water. I mean, look, if Gollum went into the bogs to try to touch these dead bodies, well, presumably to scrape anything of value out of their pockets, and couldn't actually touch them, it seems to me that makes them more of an illusion, granted a disturbing and evil illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. So I think if I had to pick a place to land, I'd actually say, at least with the elves, that even the bodies are an illusion. Now, maybe, but if there are bodies, they're only bodies. Again, because Gollum couldn't reach them. They're there. Yeah. He can see them, but then it's like a 3D projection. Yeah. He puts his hands through them and they're gone. Yeah. So
that could be.
But
there
I'm not done.
There are a couple of different possibilities to choose from.
I'm not done.
Oh, okay. All right.
No, I mean, we can banter that about, but I think you'll like where I'm going next. Because look, if it's got to be elves, I have a thought. In Unfinished Tales, Appendix B of the section on Galadriel and Celeborn, we get some insight into Legolas' grandfather, the isolationist Sindarin elf Orifer. Now, we learn that when he led his people to the Last Alliance, they refused to place themselves under the command of Gil-galad. They were also described as being ill-equipped with armor or weapons in comparison to the Eldar. So, Orifer's killed in the very first assault on Mordor. The text tells us that he was rushing forward at the head of his most doughty warriors before Gil-galad had given the signal for the advance. So here's a rebellious elf who didn't like the Noldor. He resented the intrusions of Celeborn and Galadriel. He didn't like the dwarves. And when he showed up for battle, he showed up ill-equipped and undisciplined. So given that, if we have to land on that there are real elf spirits in the marshes, they belong to Orifer and his folk. I can almost see him saying, sorry, Mandos, if those Noldor are there getting rehoused, we don't want any part of them. We'll stay right here in the swamp.
I will choose eternity here.
Yeah.
Rather than go back with Noldor. That guy.
Yeah.
I'm not spending the life of Arda with that guy.
With Gil-galad, that terrible Noldor guy. And if that's the case, that sure could explain movie Thranduil's nasty attitude, too. It's sort of that bitter, just angry man, angry pretty man.
That's his dad. Yeah.
But yeah.
That's a good find, and that I would say that certainly gives us a group of elves who are of the Eldalier, so that fits into that group that is suggested that more of these elves did that in these later days, and you're right, there probably weren't too many doing it when Sauron was around,
right?
And later days could just mean even later days, could even mean in our time.
That's true.
But it certainly gives us a group of elves that could satisfy that condition, and it gives us a sad story of unwilling soldiers who died young, had some unresolved issues they had to deal with, and man, that's got all the hallmarks of a great ghost story right there. We know that sometimes in Middle-earth, entire armies of dead guys sometimes hang around waiting to deal with unresolved issues.
That is true. That is true. Excellent. I had really enjoyed that spooky sort of Halloween-y question. Good one.
That was a very fun one, even though we landed in different places. Some really good options.
Which is rare,
there.
Folks. Enjoy that while it lasts.
I know. So thank you for that one, Mike. Yeah. We also got a question from Oscar in Stockholm, Sweden. Mm-hmm. Oscar writes in, Eriador was, at the time of Elendil and a millennium after, obviously densely populated and wealthy. But around year 3000, it was almost empty, apart from the Shire, Bree, and Rivendell. Why? The Plague and the Witch King of Angmar were both over 1,500 years ago, so the population should have bounced back as populations in our world did. And then he gives a historical example of eastern Anatolia under the Byzantine Empire, which suffered kind of plague war and centuries of raiding, but then bounced back a few hundred years later. He says, since the Shire and Bree have survived, there don't seem to be many monsters wandering about. The Barrow Wights were bound to their graves, and the old forest was also restricted. So why didn't some humans resettle Eriador? Didn't Tharbad, the settlement of Tharbad, survive into Bilbo's time?
Well, Oscar's referring to help the rest of our listeners to some of the timeline in Appendix A and B to The Lord of the Rings. Let's go over some of those numbers. The plague came to Eriador in Third Age 1636, 1637. Now, going back a bit, the Witch King of Angmar first arose in 1409, but the battles in that area lasted all the way until 1980, when the Witch King went back to Mordor. It's weird, by the way, when the years are in the 19s and 2000s, because it makes me think, like, really? That happened in 1980? Man,
I remember that, man. That was a good year.
I mean, that would have been a very good year, especially if the Witch King goes back to Mordor. But that's not quite 1,000 years before the Hobbit takes place. Now, Tharbad was a town built around a ford across the River Greyflood. Now, it was inhabited long after the fall of Arnor and even its successor kingdoms, Rhudaur and all of those, and well into the waning of Gondor. But in Unfinished Tales, we get a real strong suggestion that in the latter days it was populated by Dunlendings, and that after the days of the kings, they ceased, in fact, to be subjects of Gondor, until the town was finally abandoned in 2912 due to floods in the surrounding regions.
Okay, so 2912. That actually is very late.
That's
late.
Only. That's just.
I'm thinking that's about
25, 30 years. Yeah, 29
years.
years. That's right. So, frankly, people probably weren't quite ready to go back there yet. The disaster had been.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Really too recent. I mean, it has only been a generation. As for the rest of Eriador, there's a passage in Appendix A that gives us some clues as to what was going on. I'll go ahead and read that. When the North Kingdom ended, the Dunedain passed into the shadows and became a secret and wandering people. And their deeds and labors were seldom sung or recorded. Little now is remembered of them since Elrond departed. Although even before the watchful peace ended, evil things again began to attack Eriador, or to invade it secretly, the chieftains for the most part lived out their long lives. Aragorn I, it is said, was slain by wolves. That would have been 2327, which ever after remained a peril in Eriador and are not yet ended. In the days of Arahad I, this is going to be about 150 years later, the orcs who had, as later appeared, long been secretly occupying strongholds in the Misty Mountains, so as to bar all the passes into Eriador, there's something right there, to bar all the passes, suddenly revealed themselves. And later, in the days of Arasuel, this would be another 250 years after Arahad, so about 400 years after Aragorn I, orcs, multiplying again in the Misty Mountains, began to ravage the lands, and the Dunedain and the sons of Elrond fought with them. It was at this time that a large band came so far west as to enter the Shire, and were driven off by Bandobras Took, and that, of course, is when the game of golf was invented in 2747, little less than 200 years before our story begins.
Okay. Wow. So Eriador was really continually beset, wasn't it? I mean, there were wolves coming through there.
Yep.
There were orcs coming through there.
Multiple times for the orcs,
Yeah, multiple times. There were orcs blocking the passes
Yep.
into Eriador. There were Dunlendings, and we know that they
weren't exactly friendly to men.
Pretty savage.
Well, to the men of Gondor, I should say, because they are men.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, they were raiders, bandits, things like that. And that was all going up until really very soon before the start of events that we know from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And I'm just, we're always reminded that Middle Earth in the Third Age is in this general state of decline.
That's right.
The forces of good are just civilization is constantly waning. The shadow is constantly growing.
Yeah. Oh, that's a very medieval thing. That's
absolutely
medieval literature. That's the good times were before. They're not ahead of us. They were in the past.
Absolutely. Yeah. They're looking back to the classical period that, again, all the Enta Yawerk, these beautiful buildings that, nobody has the knowledge and technology to build anymore. Yeah. So, it just seems like there was just civilization was constantly on the wane.
Right.
And so there just really had not been enough time. There really wasn't an opportunity for people to resettle because there was just continual raiding. And I know a little bit about the Byzantine Empire, the example that Oscar gives. I don't know enough to know, how different that is from, actual history in our world. But
True.
Certainly, I mean, you could see where a region that is continually beset by raiders and bandits and monsters, maybe people wouldn't want to go back there.
Yeah, that's certainly where I'd land. Simply put, the world of men was shrinking. There were fewer and fewer safe places for them to establish residence.
Yep, I agree. Well, that was another good one. So thank you, Oscar, for that one. And again, thanks again to Mike for a very well-timed spooky ghost question.
That wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. As always, we thank you very much for joining us. Now be sure to join us again next week when we see the epic battle between Gandalf and the Great Goblin.
Epic battle? You mean Flash/Dead?
That'll do it. Folks, we want to...
Nice.
That was, I tried. It's pretty hard to get an entire character into three words. That was, for those of you who didn't catch it, a reference to the film when the Goblin King does die, when Gandalf slashes him there at the end. So, folks, we want to encourage you all to read along and take notes in your copy of The Hobbit like we do. So please check out the official library tab on our website, theprancingponypodcast.com. Whether you want inexpensive paperbacks or you want the really good stuff for your Tolkien shelf, we've got the links.
We got the really good stuff. And if you wouldn't mind heading over to iTunes for us and leaving a review, we'd really be grateful for that. Those reviews help us get more visibility in iTunes, and that in turn translates to a bigger and a more vibrant Tolkien community.
And thanks to those of you who have, by the way. We keep seeing new ones pop up, and we're so grateful for them. We read every single one of them. And we've even found a way to read the ones from overseas because, they normally don't show up in our iTunes store. That's been encouraging. So we do get to read all of them, and we really do appreciate all the nice things that you say about us, even if we don't believe them ourselves. Now make sure you never miss an episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast by subscribing to the show through iTunes or your favorite podcast app. You can find us in most any podcast directory. And be sure to check out the podcast app if you have an iPhone or an iDevice. In iOS 11 as it supports our new season and episode tags.
And we want to thank all of you who have become part of our social media family. We set out to start a Tolkien conversation that everyone could join, which is why we have the online common room on Facebook at The Prancing Pony Podcast and on Twitter at Prancing Pony Pod.
And one last thing as always, don't forget to send your questions, comments, or directions to your nearest post office to Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com. Now that is our new email address, so be sure to take note. Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com, and we'll try to get those questions into our next episode. Well, almost an hour and a half. It's still far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time.
Farewell, friends.